Did you know who I was talking about when I said the Aykroyd family last time?
No.
Okay.
I know there's a Dan Aykroyd out there somewhere. Any relation?
So, Ghostbusters is a result of the spiritualist movement. I just wanted to tell you that before we start recording.
Sure, I mean, I guess in the way any lore is associated with any other lore.
No, because Dan Aykroyd grew up in a spiritualist family, like ancestors, all spiritualists. It was a very important part of his upbringing. So he brought that into his writing in Ghostbusters, because spiritualists are not only a mixture of religion, it's also a mixture of science, because they want to explore what is in the great beyond.
Alright, I'm intrigued about this. Hello everyone!
Hi.
And welcome to episode 13C of the Interdisciplinary History Podcast. Today we will be finishing up our discussion of the Netflix miniseries Alias Grace, based on the book by Margaret Atwood of the same name. In this episode, we're specifically going to be looking at depictions of the penitentiary and the penal reforms that are occurring in this time period. We are also going to be talking a little bit about the way that sanity is understood in this time period, or rather conceptualized, and we will be talking a little bit about the spiritualist movement.
Yes. I did my stuff on spiritualism. We talked recently in all of our episodes about sort of the ideas of hysteria and stuff. So this show has been so interdisciplinary. It's been this series. We've covered so many topics. I feel like we've talked about so many at this point. We can talk a bit on that. This show is very interesting. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I'll kick us off if you'd like. So I'm gonna start actually by saying the name of a resource that I think is really interesting if you guys are interested in the way that the penal system forms in the 19th century, because our modern concept of incarceration really does solidify in the 1800s. So that's very interesting. One of the big books I drew from is called Hard Time, subtitle Reforms Penitentiary in 19th Century Canada. It's by a scholar named Ted McCroy. And the reason I highlight this book is because it's very much in this just before Confederation into post-Confederation time period that we're talking about in this show. But McCroy, as a historian, starts off with a very interdisciplinary approach. In his introduction, he's not only talking about cases, changes to the laws, changes to the way that things are being dealt with, but he spends a lot of time going through different theorists on incarceration and reform. Both of the contemporary, the ones who are impacting these changes that we see in this time period, but also scholars like Foucault, who are talking about the way that our relation between the legal system and the penal system and the idea of reform or rehabilitation, what that says about our broader society. With that, I will say that this series actually does a really good job of showing the function that the penitentiary serves in the time period that Grace lives in. You know what? I want to have this be a bit more of a dialogue, Victoria. So we've both watched the series a few times through. What are some things that you remember standing out about the prison Grace is at? So it's interesting because I read the book in conjunction with watching the show. So you see how it's sort of meant, basically it's not really meant as a way to reform or help people. It's just meant to punish. And you can sort of see with Grace, she has her head shorn because she talks too much. Or she's put into a box to just control her because she has hysteria. You can sort of see throughout the series, it's most likely that she was sexually assaulted and that she was traumatized from that. Or that she also says that maybe it's just her, that she's acting out in some way and they don't like that and they punish her for it. It's very interesting because I've got a primary source account right in front of me here of the actual Grace marks. And what I was actually pretty shocked by when I
watch the show is how they were pretty accurate to what Suzanne Moody described in the Kingston Penitentiary, except the fact that Suzanne Moody describes both the male side as well as the female side.
Can you explain who Suzanne Moody is?
Suzanne Moody, she's a famous Canadian writer at this time. She sort of just writes about parts of Canadian life and society. She's most notably known for like her work, The Life in the Clearings. Anyways, just seeing this sort of account of Grace Marks in the Kingston Penitentiary, it was just interesting how like they got it pretty close to what it was like.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that you threw the criticism out there that it doesn't seem particularly rehabilitative in this time period.
Yeah.
Because that is, in this period, the main role of the penitentiary. And even just the etymology of the word penitentiary, like, it's coming from that Christian Protestant tradition of penitence and reflection and a very individualized retraining. Ted McCroy outlines 3 main priorities that exist in the literature from this time period of what should a penitentiary do, what form should it take, what should it serve. And it's primarily concerned with labor and transforming inmates into, quote, productive workers. We have still this assumption that idle hands are responsible for criminality, be that vagrancy, be that poverty. The assumed overlap between any type of criminality and poverty in this time period is still ever present, despite the fact that Grace is working at the time that she's arrested. She is, throughout the series, when we see her in the court scenes and we see the way that she's talked about in her trial, they spend a lot of time pointing out what she doesn't have and what she could desire, be it better clothing, be it better paid, all these sorts of things. The secondary thing that a penitentiary is meant to do is it's meant to fulfill a growing desire for moral reformation and rehabilitation of individual persons. So within the 19th century, as people look for ways to respond to criminality, there is increasingly, particularly in the US and Canada, where society is on the colonial level being reconstructive and there's some social experimentation going on. We have a greater emphasis put on the individual. And that's largely because the social safety nets that did historically exist in Europe are difficult to transfer over, especially when you have the emerging industrial revolution happening in this time period. And that is becoming your central way that you belong to society, through your labor, specifically your wage labor, as opposed to religious membership, community membership, that sort of thing. The third thing that a penitentiary is meant to do is it is meant to make punishment more humane by eliminating violent methods of punishment. So in theory, a penitentiary is meant to be a very quiet place where individuals are retrained to control themselves, retrained to be productive. Life in a penitentiary is incredibly regimented in terms of what you do in different times of the day, how you do it, your behaviors inside. And in theory, this should be negating the need for corporal punishment. Now, as we see throughout the series, and as Victoria, you've already brought up, that's not the case to be seen here, really, by any stretch of the imagination. Lest we think that the TV show is trying to exaggerate the situation. It's actually very interesting because the penitentiary depicted in the show, Kingston Penitentiary, was the site of the... Now I can't read my writing, but I have it open in a tab.
Nice. I guess while you're looking at that, I was just gonna say, like, as a person who grew up Christian, watching this, I was thinking, that makes sense that this was sort of meant to make them repent. But it's repentance through embarrassment and punishment through acting out. Through the idea of embarrassment and humiliation, then you'll be able to act in line. And really, it's not. It's just because there isn't, like, corporal punishment doesn't mean it isn't abuse.
And there is a huge degree of corporal punishment being practiced in this time period.
Exactly.
And corporal punishment is still on the books for potential consequences of acting out in the penitentiary, which I'll get to because they actually nail that really well in the show, and you've given a couple of examples already. But in 1849, which is right in the time period that this story is meant to take place. At the Kingston Penitentiary, there is an incident that is generally referred to as the Booch Incident. I am pronouncing a French name here. I assume I'm mispronouncing it. It is B-E-A-U-C-H-E, and it has an accent aigu at the end of it.
Boucher?
I think it's the accent aigu.
Boucher?
Boucher?
I don't know.
It could be Boucher. The Boucher affair, that seems reasonable, which is named for the inmate involved in this. Also at play in this was the warden, Henry Smith. This led to the formation of the Brown Commission, who investigated conditions and ultimately made further recommendations of reform in the prisons. It's actually a really good series of documents that comes out of this about what life actually looked like in the prisons, which is always important to have when we're studying history, because so often we get prescriptive accounts rather than descriptive accounts. Without an incident like this, we could certainly expect to see rule books, we could expect to see timetables, we could expect to see the official accounts of what ought to have been happening. But this commission ultimately uncovers a very different and more accurate portrayal of history. So as historians, we can be thankful to some degree that this account exists. But essentially, an inmate by the name of Boucher was being loud and unruly in his cell. The way he was expressing this was through climbing, screaming, banging on bars of his cell, which gave the impression that he was perhaps trying to escape. Upon orders from Warden Smith, they open the doors. Boucher negotiates with a little bit, promising to be quiet. Upon returning to his cell, he continues to scream again. Some accounts give more details that he's screaming about actually, complaining that there's something in the cell, which some people who read these accounts think that he may be experiencing something psychological, whether he's hallucinating. We don't really know. Ultimately, corporal punishment is used. This gets out of hand. Complaints are raised upon flogging being conducted by the warden himself. So the Brown Commission is formed out of this with the mindset of needing to understand what's actually happening in the prisons. Their findings included that prisoners were being starved as a form of punishment. Rampant sexual abuse was uncovered. Corporal punishment was being widely and excessively used. And please keep in mind what excessive use means in this time period. It's not until the 1820s that we have a lot of legal literature actually arguing for these more humane penal options as opposed to corporal punishment. So you can understand that this is still relatively new and attitudes are not what they are today. It was found that Warden Henry Smith had used excessive force. The conclusion for Boucher is that he's imprisoned for a while longer. Ultimately, he's transported to a provincial asylum. I will be talking about the asylum system later on. The very interesting thing about this whole incident, though, is the inmate in question is 12 years old, which is a very stark reminder of the way adulthood is perceived in this time period. It's not until the late 19th century that we start asking questions about youth laws and creating a separate youth criminal code. And I think that we've talked already a little bit, Victoria, about how the age of the actors in this show in some ways sanitizes some of the subject matter.
Yes.
Grace, I think we've inferred, is about 16 or 18 at the time of the murder.
She's 15.
She's 15.
15 going on 16.
She is, for all intents and purposes, not just in the context of the show, but in the context of history, to be treated as an adult. Particularly because she's holding employment on her own and she doesn't have any family she's living with or being taken care of. Yeah, so that's interesting. I feel like I'm talking a lot. Do you have anything you want to kind of throw in here?
I was thinking while you were talking, just all the things you talked about, it makes me think about the level of detail Margaret Atwood took. The details into her books, and how much was kept in the series. Specifically, the scene with the apple. At the beginning of the series, Dr. Jordan brings Grace an apple. But in the book, and in the show, you kind of see it. You see, the condition she's in. She's sort of been put in. She's been isolated on her own. One of the reasons why she takes the apple is that she's been starved. They make it very clear that they don't appreciate her presence there as a celebrated murderess. So she's starved. And that's one of the reasons why she takes the apple from Dr. Jordan. And they don't talk about it in the series, much about her time in the asylum, but there is some detail from Grace about what she went through. It's very interesting how you mentioned just like, maybe I'll come back to it once you mention the asylums later.
Yeah, absolutely. I might even do asylums at the end, just so that we're broken up in our speaking a little bit, because I know that our audience doesn't just want to hear me go on and on and on.
I was actually told recently that they find us very soothing.
Yeah, I accidentally mentioned that I was editing audio to a coworker. And I know that you tell all your coworkers all about us. I don't. So they're like, what are you editing audio for? And I panicked and I said ASMR. And I said it in a, like, I panicked and I said ASMR, but I was trying to make it like a, well, clearly I don't mean ASMR, clearly I just don't want to tell you sort of situation. I don't think that's what my tone conveyed. And, yeah, good times. Good times.
You're an ASMR person now.
Yeah.
Hello everyone, this is our new ASMR podcast. It's no longer a history podcast. Sorry if you want to stay here listening to history. There you go. ASMR, just for you. Editing Sloan's gonna hate me for that.
Present Sloan is already dreading it. I'm glad that you mentioned specifically the scenes of her inside the cell. Very underrated detail, and maybe not a detail that teaches the audience something of terrible importance, but I found it very interesting. I do want to call attention that the cell size depicted in the show is legitimately the dimensions of a prison cell in Kingston Penitentiary. In the show, we see a very narrow, long prison cell that's basically taken up by the bed and a small wash basin. The cells in the Kingston Penitentiary were 7 feet by 2 feet. That tickles me. That is good set design. I'm checking a box.
Wonder if they shot on location for some places.
I don't...
Because I feel like they... I wonder if they did, because, I mean, it's in Ontario, might as well,
It is a
right?
historic site. I'm not sure how many times over it's been renovated.
Let me see. I'm just curious, because I get tickled when things are filmed on location.
And the contents of her cell are what Ted McCroy describes as being expected as standard issue for a prisoner of either gender. Something that's missing from her cell, which I think was left out because... I think that this was probably left out because I think they were worried about how the audience would perceive it, and the audience might read it as unnecessary exposition that kind of takes you out of the moment. But in most of the cells, and obviously this only applies to prisoners who could read, but in most of the cells there was actually a bulletin of 18 points that were the 18 prison offenses and their corresponding 18 punishments. These included things like admonishment or loss of light for violating the rule of silence, which I'll talk about in a moment, flogging for immoral conduct, and that is the language used. Now, that's a very broad category. Typically, immoral conduct, we might immediately assume sexual immorality. We see a flogging in the prison in one of the episodes. It's explained that someone took an extra portion at mealtime, which I suppose theft is immoral, but I'm not really sure what's going on there. The other interesting one that Ted McCroy cites is attempted escape could be punishment either through solitary or through the wearing of leg irons for a month. The rule of silence is very much emblematic of the penal system in this time period, particularly in North America. And it is all about regulating and self-control. So the silence system becomes more standardized and therefore has more documentation in Canada in the post-Confederation world. However, as we see in this show, and as documents from earlier on in the 1800s point out, the silent system was being used at Kingston Penitentiary and other jails in Canada. And as Foucault talks about in his examination, Discipline and Punish, which, if you're reading Foucault, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, because I remember when I was reading Foucault, and I don't want to go back to that place. He's a fantastic theorist. He just kind of breaks you after a while. There's a reason he's one of the most silent scholars of the 20th century. But God damn you, man. But he talks about the silent system as being a suppression of all communication between other prisoners. And one of the ultimate goals being, you've put a group of people who society has deemed deviant in one place. How do you keep them from continuing the deviant socialization process with another? Stopping communication is a very good way to do that. From a, I don't even know what I would call that, a utilitarian and authoritarian mindset. But yeah, you look like you have something to say, Victoria.
I was gonna say, it was the Kingston Penitentiary.
Excellent.
Because it's a museum now. They closed it down. It was closed down as a penitentiary in 2013 and is now a museum. So I guess it would make sense for them to have filming location there. Lots of museums have been known to completely renovate or just to change things in order to have historic spaces resemble what they were at the time. So I think that's just a cool little detail, that it was actually the Kingston Penitentiary that they used, and that most of the areas that they filmed in were in Kingston.
That's very cool.
And also The Handmaid's Tale had some scenes filmed there, apparently. Another Margaret Atwood adaptation. I'm one of the few people in this world who hasn't watched it.
I haven't watched it either.
Just this conversation now is reminding me of Madam by Phoebe Wine, which I just read. And it's actually kind of terrifying. So basically, if you haven't read it, Madam is a book about a teacher who goes and works at a boarding school in the 1990s. It is a boarding school that hasn't changed its rules since the 1800s. And it is very unorthodox because it hasn't changed its methods since the 1800s. Basically, there's different sections. If you get to a certain point called compassion, they'll shear your head. And basically, that's only because you are deviant. In some way. You don't fit the norms that they are expecting. And so you are punished, and eventually you are sent to the SAN, which is the sanatorium, because you are not fitting this ladylike norm that we want.
I love dystopian fiction of that, relatively real world rooting. I'm glad that we've looped back around to the idea of asylums, sanatoriums, and sanity. I think that the rest of my prepared notes for this fit better into that topic, but I've talked a lot and I need a refill on my tea as we're recording at 8 o'clock at night. Do you want to talk about the spiritualist movement? And then I will come back in with the role that doctors are starting to play in the legal system this time period, and our ideas of ability to be accountable for one's actions and the way rehabilitation looks in that landscape in this time period.
Yes, and I'm gonna bring up some of the ideas of women's sanity at this time.
Yeah, go for it.
Because that also connects with spiritualism.
Excellent. Don't do anything that I'm gonna have to hear.
No, I'm gonna be drinking my peach nectar.
Excellent. We're gonna have some good glugging ASMR.
Just for you, Sloan.
Alright, my kettle shut off, so game face on.
I promise I won't gargle this time into the mic, Sloan. I'm just gonna tell you one thing about Suzanne and Moody.
Yeah?
Inconsistent spelling.
Welcome to reading historical documents.
Well, no, she did not do her research on how to spell names.
Welcome to reading historical documents.
Yes, well, I know she's doing a whole bit on the case. Did not even care to actually look up the spelling of Kinnear. So she wrote a Kinnaird.
Keenard?
Kinnaird.
Keenard.
You gotta put on a Scottish brogue. Kinnaird. That was bad.
Dude.
Kinnaird.
I'm Irish and I'm somehow offended by that.
Kinnaird.
Stop.
To be fair, that Scottish accent was more Spanish.
Yeah.
Because at this point...
That's why it was offensive.
Well, it's the R rolling, because I'm so used to speaking Spanish, it's like...
You're more used to speaking English, which does not roll the R. Alright, we gotta get back on track, because I already have an hour and a half to edit, and, yeah.
My audio is actually much shorter, I think. Let's see. Hour and 15 minutes.
Oh! Is that all? Mine's an hour 18. Because I caught that little bit of banter about the...
about
Dan Aykroyd.
About Dan Aykroyd. Okay, so what is spiritualism? It was a movement that started during the Victorian period, gaining in popularity in time, but really the peak was the First World War. People just wanted to connect with their loved ones. It still remained relatively popular, but it really trickled out of popularity after World War II. You really don't hear about it as much in the popular media as like before. Though in the 1920s and 30s, you sort of had the fun time of seeing Harry Houdini unmasking famous con artists who were masquerading as spiritualists and as mediums. It was very popular mainly because of low mortality rates. Even though that they were rising, there was still a lot of deaths out there from tuberculosis, typhoid fever, yellow fever, scarlet fever, all that kind of stuff.
You're talking about the 1900s again? Or the 18th century?
Going back to the Victorian period,
okay.
All those different sicknesses. People were still losing family members, even though mortality rate was less than it was before. People want to talk to their dead loved ones. I still see that today. People wanting to talk to mediums, to talk to the dead. We want this confirmation that there is life after death and that there is something beyond what we have, then that all of our work in life is actually towards something when we don't really know.
I'm not trying to be an edgelord here, but good lord, who would want more life after this?
Harry Houdini was like, you could hold some seances, but I don't believe in this shit for me. So after 10 years, if I don't come back, there isn't an afterlife. So Harry Houdini, folks, confirmed that there isn't anything worth looking forward to. Alright, going back to it. According to Stan McMullen, and I'll leave the book that I used in the description, spiritualism was typically derived into two classifications, religious and scientific. So if we were to give some examples in fiction, we would say the Warden's family and their peers are the spiritualists. I would say Jeremiah kind of fits in the scientific field because he goes for mesmerism and is still connected with the spiritualist movement in that because he is capitalizing on it. Claudine Massicot says, quote, "It was a movement that was constantly challenging the boundaries between life and death, science and faith, private and public, masculine and feminine ideals," unquote. Which I think is very interesting, especially when you connect that with Alias Grace. Because you see characters moving between gender roles, the difference in power dynamics between men and women. Because, like I said on the last episode, the relationships Grace has are interesting because while she's also the powerless one in certain points, she's also the one that has power in others. And the reason why masculinity is so connected with the spiritualist movement is because of emotion. Because emotion was considered to be key to connecting to the dead. In his article, A Higher Power to Feel, Brett E. Carroll talks about how masculinity and spiritualism were very interconnected, and how basically spiritualism had a lot of men unpack their feelings about their masculinity in a time where it wasn't really accepted, because spiritualism, you are connecting with the dead, you are showing emotion, you are, by the fact that you want to connect with the dead and you don't want to accept the fact that they are gone, they are in heaven, they're dead. So by doing this, you are breaking the norms of what is acceptable. With that, they also have to examine their emotions, which are typically connected to women. Basically at this time, in Brett A. Carroll's article, he talks about how there really is no opportunities for women at this time for any religious organization to have power in unless they're, say, a nun, or if they're participating in their church circle. Like, that was really it.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind is because we're dealing with a heavily Protestant population in Upper Canada in this time period, those sorts of abbey positions aren't really made available.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't really have convents full of women. You have some Catholics who are coming over and setting that up for the men, but the priority isn't really there for women and nuns.
No, and it's more of in the area of what we now know as
Lower Canada.
Yes, exactly.
Which, I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm still not totally clear on whether the whole Upper and Lower Canada thing is pejorative or not.
It doesn't make sense at all.
Like, the Highlands and the Lowlands, like, those are geographic things. Upper and Lower Canada, I know it's not intended to be north and south, because Lower Canada is further north. Tell us in the comments if you know, friends.
It was never really confirmed to me. I took multiple classes on Canada before and after Confederation. There really isn't much clarification. I personally think it is because they saw Upper Canada as being more important and Lower Canada as not being the priority.
Yeah, and like I do wonder if it isn't kind of like it was geographic, but it was also convenient from the English-speaking perspective to reinforce the idea of English supremacy. I apologize for interrupting you.
No, it's okay. I was just saying what is now Quebec, mainly because some of our listeners might not know about how Canada was set up before Confederation and that we had multiple different...
Yeah, we've got a very, very international listening audience, and I do wonder how that's, how this is playing out for the...
Because most of our audience is in the United States, which is very interesting.
I mean, most of our audience is in the United States, but, like, according to my metrics, and I mean, I recognize that VPNs exist, so maybe that's where it's coming from. If you are actually listening from Guam, please drop me a message. Please put that in our social media. That's amazing. That's thrilling. If you're not a VPN, it would make my day. And if you are a VPN, I'm still happy you're listening.
As am I. I don't know if we want to do a discussion on the legacies of Confederation in Canada one day. Because I feel like that is a heavy topic, and it's a very complicated topic.
It's colonization. And
it is colonization.
We both believe that academia and society at large needs to continue to go through its decolonization, and we support a post-colonial world and mindset. So I don't think we have time to get into that. I also don't think we're prepared.
Yeah. Anyways, people talk about spiritualism when it's more connected with America and with Britain, like, because those are two areas that in our pop culture consciousness, that's where we most connected with. Previously, I talked about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in Great Britain and the Fox sisters, even though they were by birth Canadian. They went around America. That was where they made their money. That's basically where it was. Canada, relatively conservative in the way it approached spiritualism for a good while. People didn't really have an interest in it for a good while. However, it started to gain popularity around the same time that Alias Grace is taking place. Small spiritualist groups formed, although not as prominently in America. They were gaining traction. They were sending out letters, creating lots of pamphlets and publications, holding meetings, and eventually they had a large publishing sector for magazines and such dedicated to investigating the spiritualist phenomenon, which is very interesting. Couldn't find many of these because, frankly, a lot of the stuff on early spiritualism in Canada is very hard to find. I found like one microfiche document from 1915, and it was so faded to the point that it was illegible. Because, you know, we're Canada. We're so great at archiving things.
I mean, you're not wrong.
In the prep for this series, I tried to find some court documents in relation to Grace Marks's case. Really hard. There really isn't anything in the online archives about it. It isn't as extensive as, say, the Old Bailey archive, which is... I love the Old Bailey.
Yeah, if anyone is interested in crime in England post-1500, Old Bailey Archive, Victoria and I have both used it in coursework. I used it when I did my independent research project. I'll throw a link in the description. It is epic.
Oh, good. Such a great resource.
So there you are, folks. There's just some bonus primary source resources that we're going to hand out to you.
If you can get primary sources, just be happy if they're legible, right?
Well, okay, so yeah, and that's something Victoria and I both love about these, is the academics who have put these databases together have both scanned and transcribed.
Yes.
Everything. So you get the original, like, somebody wrote this in beautiful, entirely undecipherable handwriting, and then it's been typed up. Sometimes there's annotations about weird spellings that help you figure that sort of thing out. It's excellent.
It's great. Anyways, back to spiritualism. But yeah, I tried to read it. It was near impossible. Spiritualism, in a way, it was a religion and it was a fad. It holds a very interesting place in society because spiritualism was built with the idea that it was a marker of class. If you could participate in it, if you could afford to have, say, all these seances, hire a medium to go and visit you, that was a signifier of wealth. If you could have someone doing this, then fantastic, you have made it. It was a fad. It's kind of like,
which is, of course, what attracts the character of Jeremiah into becoming a hypnotist.
This is exactly what I was getting into. I'm glad you're seeing where I'm going with this. So, even though it was largely associated with the upper classes, it was an avenue for people who wanted to gain class mobility and acquire capital over time. We can see that with Jeremiah, who started out as a peddler in the show. Grace meets him, and he's struggling. He's trying to make a life for himself, but he really he can't. The only way he can make money is if they let him in the house, and even then he faces a good amount of discrimination for the work he's doing.
You say that like he's a vampire. If they let him in the house.
Well, in a way they do. They're like...
I know what you mean. Like, he's a peddler.
Jeremiah.
You have to be willing to trade with a peddler, but I'm sorry, friend.
I'm glad you think that I ended a vampire reference. I love a good vampire, and frankly, Zachary Levi.
This isn't even the most upsetting thing we've talked about on this show.
Could you imagine? So long as he's not wearing a blonde wig, I think he would be a great vampire.
I don't know where blonde wig came from.
Androl from Thor. Blasphemy.
I thought maybe you were talking about the awful blonde situation that Tom Cruise has in Interview with a Vampire, but I was like, no, Victoria hasn't seen that.
I have seen that.
Oh, you've seen the movie?
I haven't read it.
Oh, that you need to read it all the more now, because that is a bad adaptation. That is a failed adaptation.
It wasn't a great movie, but I love Antonio Banderas.
Yeah, okay. God, I don't want to edit this. It's 9:00 at night.
I just wanted to be Puss in Boots.
What are you even talking about at this point?
In a hat. Antonio Banderas. He voices Puss in Boots in Shrek. You would get this if you watched Shrek 2.
Stop talking about Shrek on our podcast about interdisciplinary approaches to history.
Shrek is a foundational part of my personality. Okay.
That's a character flaw.
I think it's a character strength. Squeeze me.
I'm gonna have to edit this. I'm gonna have to edit all of this.
I'm sorry, friend.
I'm gonna have to relive this when I edit it.
I'm gonna make you some beautiful pumpkin scones as thank you for this whole series.
I don't like that I'm that easy to manipulate.
My pumpkin scones are pretty good, but I don't know if I can ever make them gluten-free. Anyways, spiritualism was one of those ways for people to make money in a way that wasn't just the normal routes. And Jeremiah, throughout the story, he talks about how he has had a lot of odd jobs over the years. He's worked in circuses, he's done all this crazy stuff. So for him, this is just another job. This is just another thing for him to do. He's a jack of all trades. But he is a mesmerist. And a mesmerist is basically, he hypnotizes people. And he tries to make himself appear like a proper scientist. Because he does believe in his work. He does believe in the work he's doing. He wants to help Grace. Because at this point, his name is Dr. Jerome. He wants to see if he can help Grace attain her innocence. Even though people don't even realize his connection to her. But he's not taken seriously by Dr. Jordan because it's not accepted. And that's the thing is because he's a spiritualist, because he is partaking in the spiritualist movement, he is capitalizing on it, people don't take him seriously because he's capitalizing off of that. He's also connected with his emotions because of this. With spiritualism, it forces men to look at their emotions and use them. And that was just not accepted, especially by people like Simon Jordan, who are emotionally constipated and sexually repressed.
You're not wrong.
So basically, he's capitalizing, but he also wants to use it for his own benefit because he still cares about Grace and he wants to see her free. They believe that through spiritualism, not only could they gain a higher sense of knowledge about their religion, but also about just life in general and science. And so, basically, in a way, Jeremiah is giving into the optimism that is spiritualism, the hope that he will eventually understand what's going on with the world around him, and with Grace, a person he considered being in a romantic relationship with. The scene where Grace is hypnotized and seemingly conjures Mary Whitney is one of the most compelling in the series. Mainly because the tension of the show has been leading to this very point where all is supposed to be revealed, but in a way it isn't, because we don't know if Grace is actually hypnotized and it's Mary Whitney coming out. We don't know what's going on. That's the beauty of this show. You don't know what the hell to think. And basically, even though Jeremiah clearly states that he is a man of science and that he is just doing the basic knowledge of hypnotism that he has grown to know and to use, everyone around him, because he is so entrenched himself into the spiritualist movement at this point, they want to believe that there is something in that everything they're doing for Grace is not for nothing. So they, of course, are going to still believe that he is doing something for her that involves the movement itself. Because that's just the way it is. And we've talked about how she is constantly underestimated because she's a woman, but also because she's a woman who's been classed as a deviant, she's also someone that people neither trust or they just want to infantilize her. That's just the thing with her. They all have conflicting opinions about her because of the ideas at this time. Brett E. Carroll talks about this again in his article, is that women were seen as more emotionally expressive, less aggressive, and more passive beings, which made them more effective guides spiritually and emotionally. That's why people see Grace and they underestimate her as a liar or as a con for possibly just putting on this character of Mary Whitney, because as I talked about in the previous episode, in the show, they show that Grace has an Irish accent only for her to slip into a fully realized Canadian accent near the end during this scene. People constantly underestimate her. They want to believe. People want to believe. The spiritualists are the molders of the Victorian period. That's it. Basically, getting down to brass tacks, that's who they are. They want to believe. In this moment, they want to believe Grace is innocent. They want to believe that she's a woman who could not have even committed these crimes. Basically, Grace's testimony as Mary Whitney in the seance/hypnotist form, Grace is taken seriously because she's a woman and because of the fact that she's a woman and women are seen as the more spiritually connected ones at this point in the spiritualist movement. That is why she is taken seriously. Whereas Jeremiah, because he's a man and in a way he hasn't fully tried to connect with the movement, he is still trying to make himself seem like a scientist when really what he's doing is trying to capitalize on spiritualist movement. He's still not showing his true emotion. No one believes him, but they'll believe her because she's showing this emotional side to her, even if she's lying.
I like that you bring up the duality of, is this a science, is this more a spiritual movement? Something that I find very interesting that Ted McCoy talks about, and I also have another article that I'm going to very briefly touch on, because this is a genuinely interdisciplinary article. This is published in a psychiatric journal, and it is talking about institutionalization rates in asylums in the Victorian era, so I need to get to that. But one of the things that is emerging at this time period is a sort of dual role of doctors, because they are both responsible for defining health and categorizing who is well enough to be a worker in terms of the broader legal system when we look at things like sanity and insanity. But they are also defining moral judgments as they do that. Because to be fit to work and being fit and well enough to provide productive labor to society and productively reintegrate into society carries a lot of moral weight. At the same time, they are also defining mental acumen and the ability to make moral judgments. And that's where we get into the idea of sanity versus insanity. It's worth mentioning that sanity and insanity are not technically medical terms, though we use them a lot in medicine. They are legal terms, defined by, are you capable of recognizing the gravity of your actions, recognizing right from wrong, and a few other things. There's a tendency for, and we've already talked about this a little bit, there's a tendency for revisionist history to underemphasize instances of violence in both penitentiaries and asylums. Already in this episode, we've talked about the role that penitentiaries were meant to play in getting people back into community, this idea of rehabilitation, but rehabilitation being defined along the lines of, can you productively contribute to a industrializing society, as much as it's about, are you safe to the society you're going to be reintroduced to. Chu, Santon, and Harbsetter, in a 2018 article just entitled Views from Inside an Asylum, talk a little bit about just how long the mentality towards institutionalization endures. It emerges in the mid-19th century, and it's not until the 1970s that we really see a movement to deinstitutionalize. The deinstitutionalized movement also being very strongly influenced by advances in the pharmaceutical industry. Regardless, in the case study that these scientists look at, they see that from the start of the Victorian era, the asylum is designated as a place to treat those already assumed to be curable. And we know that Grace spends a period of time in an asylum. We see some of images of the abuse that she endures and the conditions in there. But unlike the workhouse, which is used to provide social support and the welfare for those considered incurable, the asylum is really intended to be a temporary sort of situation. And in a cursory study of subjects from various institutions in England in the 19th century, we see most individuals are eventually released and re-enter into the communities rather than dying in the conditions of being institutionalized. In general, males were more likely to be institutionalized than females. And understanding these social situations of the day, we can view that as a symptom of the patriarchal controls that women were subject to. Ideas like hysteria, those sorts of things that are very gendered. Women within patriarchal societies tend to have more immediate social supports available. Because we assume women to be less capable of themselves, we generally put the responsibility on an immediate male family member. So because of this, women are less likely to be put into situations of institutionalization than men are, because men do not have that same type of familial support. I'm not in any way suggesting that that makes patriarchy good for women. It's just emblematic of the paternalism that women experience. Grace not having any family to fall upon or to look after her, that's one of the reasons that she is more likely to find herself in this situation. So I think the show does an excellent job of showing that. In general, the actual images are few and far between, aside from showing that the conditions there weren't much better. The show certainly doesn't sanitize the situation inside asylums or sanatoriums in this time period, but they do get it right that it is a very generally temporary situation for a person to find themselves in. In Grace's case, that is going from an apparent break or an apparent state of irrationality into a prison system afterwards. But yeah, very, very, very interesting.
Yeah, and in the book, there's a lot more details, and it's very interesting because you do see the variety in the asylum of the people that Grace deals with, because she sees about people who actually have mental illness. There's a woman who her mental illness is very focused on religion, and she sees Grace as a sinner, and because she's heard that she's a murderer, she's like, great, I'm gonna baptize you with a bowl of soup. There's another woman, and Grace says later on, yeah, she was just put in by her husband. There's nothing wrong with her. She was just put in by her husband. And then there's another woman, and she is homeless, and she just says, I just came here so I would have somewhere warm to stay during the winter that wasn't the workhouse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what you described in kind of the second case there, that is something that we see sort of continuously as a possibility, is the legal system will put men into the asylums, and the legal system will put women who don't have any male relations to take care of them into asylum. But there's also a great degree of freedom for husbands or fathers to assert that a female relation needs to be put into a situation of institutionalization. All in all, I think that while they are brief, there is no glaring inaccuracies depicted in the series. There isn't a huge amount of exposition aside from the cruel conditions, but they do, when you read between the lines, show a very good and a very accurate depiction.
Yes. And I think we can say that with a lot of the things we've talked about in this mini-series we've done, is that this show had a really surprising amount of accuracy in a lot of areas. It's a great watch. I think you can just see the amount of work and detail that they've put into this to make it not only a watchable series, but a series that you can watch and maybe learn something from.
Yeah, one of the reasons that on this podcast we bring up a lot of pop culture is obviously because we have an interdisciplinary approach, but I think that we always kind of want to catch a series and what they got wrong. And certainly this is not a comprehensive view of the past, nor is it aiming to. This is not a documentary on the real individual whose name and story it borrows from. But in general, the world building, if you want to use that kind of term, is well done.
Yeah, and it examines the era's ideas about gender, sexuality, religion, and placing that all together and putting that really into characters. And I've talked a lot about character, but it's because they've shown really the era's ideals through them. You sort of see that in the repressed Simon Jordan to the hopelessly optimistic Jeremiah, who he never really gets what he really wants in the end because
he's a vampire.
He never truly gets the success he really wants. In the book, he eventually goes on to do some more stuff on the side. He and Grace see each other from afar. That was it. And then we also see Grace, who is the paradox of the Victorian woman.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, well, I think we can close our discussion of Alias Grace. 3 episodes, we really milked this for all it was worth. And we hope you enjoyed it, listeners.
Yeah, I hope so. We've put in so much work into this.
God, how many times do you think you watched that series through?
I'm gonna say 4.
Yeah, I feel like I'm at 6 or 7. It's a treadmill show. It's on Netflix. It's one of those, enduring Netflix Canada options that doesn't disappear periodically. So if you guys want to check it out on there, absolutely.
Yeah.
Victoria is quite fond of listening to it on audiobooks, so there's some great ones of that available. It's a Canadian classic, so your local library probably has it.
Yes.
And we might just possibly have a copy for one of you lucky people. We are going to be doing another book giveaway. Details will be in our next episode, so stay tuned and stay safe.
Stay safe. Goodbye. Before we sign off, Sloan and I would like to acknowledge that MacEwan University, this podcast, and all the content we create are located and produced on Treaty 6 territory. This land has traditionally and continues to be a home, place of gathering, and meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This includes the Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Saulteaux, and Cree First Nations. You can find our podcast on all of your favorite podcast directories and on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter @hist@mac, Instagram, which is @history@mac, or on Facebook under the name of the Interdisciplinary History Group at MacEwan. We will leave links to these social media pages and our blog in the description box of your favorite podcast directory. If you would like to be a guest or have a suggestion for a future episode or blog post topic, please let us know by shooting an email to interdisciplinaryhistgroupmu@gmail.com. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. Stay tuned for our next recording. Goodbye. Have a nice day. Stay safe. Wear a mask. All right, take 2. Just for you. I know that there's going to be multiple different versions, so I figured Sloan, you'd want extra. Before we sign off, Sloan and I would like to acknowledge that MacEwan University, this podcast, and all the content we create are located and produced on Treaty 6 territory. This land has traditionally and continues to be a home, place of gathering, and meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This includes the Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Saulteaux, and Cree First Nations. You can find our podcast on all of your favorite podcast directories and on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter @hist@mac, Instagram, which is @history@mac, all lowercase, or on Facebook under the name of the Interdisciplinary History Group at MacEwan. We will also leave these links. We will also leave links to these social media pages and our blog in the description box below. If you would like to guest or have a suggestion for a future episode or blog post topic, please let us know by shooting an email to interdisciplinaryhistgroupmu@gmail.com. That is interdisciplinaryhistgroupmu@gmail.com. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. It means so much to Sloan and I. We are really grateful, and we hope to keep on doing this in the future. All right, I'll let you go now, but stay tuned for the next recording. It'll be up soon, so stay tuned. All right, bye. Wear a mask, stay safe. Da 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 da. Number 3. All right. Before we sign off, Sloan and I would like to acknowledge that MacEwan University, this podcast, and all the content we create are located and produced on Treaty 6 territory. This land has traditionally and continues to be a home, place of gathering, and meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This includes the Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Saulteaux, and Cree First Nations. You can find our podcast on all of your favorite podcast directories and on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter at @histatmac, Instagram, which is @history@mac, or on Facebook under the name of Interdisciplinary History Group at MacEwan. We will leave links to these social media pages and our blog in the description box below on any of your favorite podcast directories. If you would like to guest or have a suggestion for a future episode or blog post topic, please let us know by shooting an email to interdisciplinaryhistgroupmu@gmail.com. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. Please stay tuned for our next recording. We're really excited for it. Okay, bye! Wear a mask.